So as I mentioned in my latest extravaganza, check it here, there were 2 James Bond movies released in 1983. Never Say Never Again with Sean Connery as James Bond and Octopussy with Roger Moore as James Bond. Now how on earth did this happen? 2 James Bond movies? Did somebody miss the memo? What do you mean you hired Sean Connery? I just signed Roger Moore's contract. None of that. It wasn't a mistake, there were no lawsuits. Just 2 very successful movies with James Bond as the main character. And I'll explain in this video why the unofficial one of the 2 is the most interesting, especially if you like Star Wars. So what happened? In 1959, Ian Fleming, the writer of the James Bond novels, was trying to make the first James Bond movie. And for that he partnered up with Kevin McClory, a producer, and they wrote a James Bond screenplay. Now to be clear, this was a couple of years before the actual franchise that we know now, that is world famous, started. That started in 1962 with Dr. No. This was 1959. Long story short, this screenplay was never turned into a movie for several reasons. So Ian Fleming thought, I'll just use the story of that screenplay and turn it into a book. And he wrote the James Bond novel Thunderball. But after that, Kevin McClory sued him because Fleming never asked McClory if he could use the story from the screenplay as the inspiration for his new book. Now this all went to court and a judge ruled that Kevin McClory had the rights to the story and the screenplay, but Ian Fleming would have the rights to the novel. Now how that makes any sense, I have no idea. So fast forward a bit, in 1962 the actual first James Bond movie was made, Dr. No, by a different production company, and all was well. Now by 1973 Sean Connery had made 6 James Bond movies and he quit the franchise, frustrated apparently, because he said he would never ever play the role of James Bond again. Roger Moore took over and by 1983 Roger Moore starred in the 13th official James Bond movie called Octopussy. However, Kevin McClory still had the rights to that original screenplay. And he looked at the by then a very successful James Bond franchise and probably thought, why don't I make my own James Bond movie? And he did. And one of the things they did is they asked the old James Bond, Sean Connery, if he would agree to play James Bond one last time in this fake James Bond movie. And surprisingly Sean Connery said yes. Or probably yes. And that is why the movie is called Never Say Never Again.
Never say never again.
And I like the movie because it doesn't take itself too seriously.
I hope we're going to have some gratuitous sex and violence.
I certainly hope so too.
And Never Say Never Again, as said, is not an official Bond movie, and you can see it by a couple of things. For instance, it doesn't have the gun barrel opening scene. It doesn't have the Bond theme. And different actors playing Q and M.
Revolutionaries kidnap a millionaire's daughter and held her captive for 8 weeks.
However, it does have Sean Connery as James Bond, the OG James Bond. And it has a few other things going for it. For instance, the stunt coordinator for Never Say Never Again is Steven Seagal. And this is 1983, so it's not fat Russian Steve, it's lean, mean, kick-ass Steve. Also, Never Say Never Again was the breakthrough movie for Kim Basinger. And you might remember Rowan Atkinson, Mr. Bean, spoofing the James Bond movies with his own Johnny English movies. But did you know that Rowan Atkinson was in an actual James Bond movie?
Nigel Smallfoot, British Embassy, Nassau.
How'd you do, Nigel?
It's pretty cool, right? But probably the coolest thing is that Never Say Never Again was directed by Irving Kershner. Now, if you're a film nerd, this should ring some serious bells. Because in 1980, 3 years before Never Say Never Again, Kershner directed another movie from the Hendacology I mentioned in Extravaganza 13. Oh yeah, Kershner directed The Empire Strikes Back, considered by many as the best Star Wars movie from the franchise. So the legendary Empire Strikes Back and the fake James Bond movie Never Say Never Again were directed by the same dude. So if anybody ever points a gun at you and asks you which 1983 James Bond movie you should watch, you should say Never Say Never Again. Also, if this actually happens, you should probably rethink a couple of your life choices. That's it for now. Goodbye.